Hey guys, good day to you all. This is John Callan from KHL Motorsport, and this is the Contact Patch podcast where the rubber meets the road. Today's topic is quite esoteric. It's basically interesting, probably to me alone. We're gonna discuss about um, my thought process or my how do I use my academic background in tuning cars. I did study in a nice university, but I didn't study engineering. Actually, my undergrad is quite interestingly business economics. So I'm an economics major in a prestigious university here in the Philippines. Also, quite surprisingly, even after dabbling in the automotive business after college for a long time, did get a master's degree and it was still not related to cars at all. Interestingly, I have an MBA. Of course, um, in my free time, in my spare time, in my hobbies and passions and business, definitely I've dabbled into cars and I do love cars, as you know. Aside from doing business with relation to cars, having a car garage workshop, sales of car parts, accessories, and whatnot. I'm also was very fortunate to be able to work professionally in motorsport in several functions as a photographer, as a writer, and quite recently, in my past history, spent 2 years of my life as a motorsport official, the low end kind, but still a motorsport official in the Philippines nonetheless. Over 17 years of being a competitor, motorsport professional, car nut. My education is very informal with regards to cars. My Going back to my formal education, it's kind of unrelated to cars. But as in all things, I honestly believe that God gave you paths in life and experiences in life and lessons in life that really guide you and mold you towards a direction, a journey that you will find yourself spot on to your desires, your whims, your fancies, your trajectories, your vision. In my experience in tuning cars, personal cars, and cars for people, tied in with my kinda unrelated academic background of economics and business management, I'd like to share with you my thoughts on how does a guy like me who is an economist and business manager, how does a guy like me tune cars, modify cars? But before that, I'd like to thank today's sponsor. Today's sponsor is KVI Quiklube, your source for tires, wheels, batteries, lubricants in the Sucat, Parañaque area. And KVI Quiklube would like to formally welcome a new product into its stable of products that it sells. So KVI Quiklube now sells Total Lubricants. Total is a French brand of the lubricants. Total is how they pronounce it in the English way. We Filipinos call it Total. So henceforth, I shall call it Total. So right now, we have stock of the Quartz 9000 fully synthetic oil for gasoline engines. And for a limited time, there are free giveaways for every purchase of a fully synthetic change oil package at KVI Quick Lube for gasoline engines. So if you guys are interested, please do check out KVI Quick Lube at facebook.com/kvi.Quiklube. So KVI Quick Lube is located in 4th Estate, Sucat, Parañaque. So thank you KVI Quick Lube for your help in supporting this podcast episode. All right, so let's get down to brass tacks. How does an economist tune cars? my background in business economics is very interesting. It's very math heavy, and I'm not a super math guy. I can handle algebra. I was able to learn calculus. I was able to understand the concept of limits. Uh, but of course, after I graduated in 2011, and it's 2022. It's been 11 years since that time, and definitely I kind of forgot most of everything that I've learned. I'm sure everyone is also in a similar boat such as I, especially if you don't use it on your daily professional life. These mathematical stuff. What I really found difficult, even as a student, was a thing called matrix multiplication, which was something we really had to do and figure out when we did econometrics. So I don't even know what econometrics is anymore, but I remembered I almost failed that subject. I passed by the skin of my teeth. At least for that subject. But I did graduate cum laude in that university, so that wasn't so. I'm not a dumb student, but I'm not the smartest guy also in the shed. I'm pretty okay, I guess. Very rough familiarization with mathematics really helps when you're trying to study engineering things. But since I'm not an engineer, I don't even know what thermodynamics is. Something to do with burning and all that. I don't know. In high school, a professor gave me a book on thermodynamics. I've never opened it. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, sir. So, Sir Ez from high school, thank you so much for your kind sentiment. But I studied economics, not engineering or physics. So it's kinda wasted on me, unfortunately. But I still am in the car business, so I guess eh, vicariously it helped. So anyway, I digress. But there are certain simple things that you can do when you are evaluating tuning and concepts, evaluating spring rates, obviously the relationship in torque and horsepower, but that's, I don't know, trivia. But economics did not really teach me how to become a mathematician, but it has taught me how to become analytical in thinking in the sense of economic principles of but the brass tacks of economics is my own definition. When you have a bunch of choices, but you have a bunch of constraints also, and yet each choice has its own reward, and yet each choice has its own costs. Okay, if you had all the resources, you could just choose everything. But let's say, for example, okay, let's put it direct to cars, right? Okay, when you are conceptualizing, all right, I want to improve the horsepower of my car. What do I do to improve the horsepower of my car? I can always put a bigger engine, or I could put a turbo, or I could put a supercharger, or I could put nitrous, or I could remap the car, or put an intake, or put an exhaust, or just buy a faster car, right? So there you have all these many choices, but of course, you can do every single one of those choices if you have enough funds. And sometimes it's not also about money. Sometimes certain choices preclude other choices from being chosen. So if you're gonna put a supercharger, you can always put an exhaust designed for a natural aspirated car. But if you're doing a turbo car, you can't put a exhaust header for an NA setup, for a turbo setup. So those things do not jive, right? We have all these choices, and the study of economics allows you or gives you a framework to decide on these things, which would give you the most efficient solution moving forward, right? So much in the same way it helps on transactions, buying this one for X amount while you can get it the same thing cheaper, or you can get a different thing more expensive but the value of it is higher, or you buy all, right? Or you buy none. If you don't have enough money, you buy none, right? You just stick to whatever it is that you already have. So that's for me, that's economics. That might be a wrong definition. You guys can freely comment and tell me how wrong I truly am. But that's my definition, at least in the context of this discussion. Not all of us are blessed with unlimited resources. I don't think anyone is, even the richest of rich guys, right? But there is always a constraint to the resources that you have. A typical resource is money. Okay, that's obvious. But another resource is skills. If you're not good enough to drive a fast car, then you'll always be slow. Sometimes it's the ability to understand car tuning knowledge. It's just that everyone has their own abilities and has their own competitive advantage. So competitive advantage is another economic term. Each and every one of us has their advantages and disadvantages, our abilities and disabilities in life. Okay? So when it comes to economics, there's a concept of absolute advantage and comparative advantage. Let's say the US versus the Philippines, right? Let's just say that one. America can make everything, and they can make it better than the Filipinos can. Even Japan, for example, can make all sorts of products and can do it way better in quality than here in the Philippines. But not all of the things it's worth for Japan to do. I mean, they can make cars, they're continuing to make cars, it's still worth it for them to make. But wiring harnesses, it's labor intensive, while the Japanese are very good when it comes to their craft. But labor costs in Japan are so expensive. So wiring harnesses are one of the sources for them is here in the Philippines. Wiring harnesses are made here because it's hard to make wiring harnesses by machine. So it's made by hand and laid down by hand. So we have those facilities here in the Philippines that make wiring harnesses for these modern cars in Japan and in other countries of the world. Okay, it's not about cheaper. Maybe Philippines also has cost disadvantages like cost of electricity, cost of land. No, well, land is cheap here. Cost of labor, yeah, cost of labor is not so expensive, but there is a hidden cost of labor like people being militant, right? People doing strikes and all that. So there's a risk there that is not necessarily accountable in monetary terms. And yet, wiring harnesses are made here because it makes more sense for them to make it here than for Japan to make it. Much in the same way as tuning also is concerned. You can buy an expensive car. There is an absolute advantage to buying a Porsche and racing a Porsche. Maybe perhaps using another car would be more value for money or more fun or more practical. But a Porsche will probably decimate over 95 to 97% of the cars in the road on a circuit basis. But sometimes you derive the true benefits of even driving a slower car than driving a Porsche or a McLaren or a Ferrari. So sometimes using a cheap car has its own advantages vis-a-vis a car with all the advantages already ingrained in it. So that's one application for that concept of economics. And again, since we don't have all the choices, the abilities, we do have the choices, but we don't necessarily have the resources to do all the choices, right? So we are always operating in a condition of scarcity. So that's the thing that economists always have at the back of their mind, that hey, we don't have enough resources, so what's the best way moving forward, right? For example, let's say we're tuning an engine, we're modifying an engine, okay? I mean, you guys know that horsepower is a function of torque. So if you increase the torque, you increase the power. If you also and also horsepower is also a function of RPM. So if you increase the RPM, even though you leave the torque constant, you increase horsepower. They call this concept in economics ceteris paribus, all things held equal. So another economic term. However, so if you want to increase the horsepower and you don't want to modify the engine, leave it at the stock torque level, you just increase the revs, right? At least in theory. But in practice, you can't have all the revs. There's always a trade-off. And torque is limited. And the longevity of the engine is also suspect. If you cannot rev a normal engine to 18,000, 20,000 RPM, right? It's gonna explode. There are mechanical limits to that. Strength of an engine when it comes to high revs. When you're tuning an engine, usually you will hit a mechanical limit to the revving of the engine. Let's say, for example, a 4AGE, which actually I'm thinking about very heavily nowadays, right? Okay, 4AGE is a natural aspirated engine. The one we've got is a 16 valve, not the 20 valve. But anyway, you cannot rev a 4AGE, a stock one, beyond 9,000 RPM. The limit of the valve train is not necessarily the valve train, but the limit is the oil pump. At above 9,000 RPM, the stock oil pump shatters due to harmonic resonance and the load of high RPM spinning. Okay, so if you are just relying on the stock components, you cannot rev above 9,000 RPM. But you can rev to 9,000 RPM. So how are you going to modify your engine towards that constraint of 9,000 RPM? That's where you see that you're scarce in the ability to rev. Then what you're gonna do now to put the power down? Do you increase torque? How do you increase torque? Is increase of displacement, right? You can also increase compression. You can also put a turbo. Okay, but if you're not putting forced induction, you're not putting nitrous, you're just gonna do a mechanical tune, you're just gonna tune it naturally aspirated, then what you're gonna do, your torque is limited. There's always going to be a limit, right? If you're still limited to your camshafts, you're stuck with your camshafts, then you're stuck with the power band of the camshafts that you're running if it's the stock one. However, there's a gadget called adjustable cam gears where you could adjust the power band. So that's a usual trick that these popular engines have that you could do if you want to be a dyno queen using the stock engine components but having an adjustable cam timing. Okay, the trick there is to retard your cam timing for intake and exhaust. You automatically shift the power band higher. So when you shift the power band higher, you have more torque at higher RPM. And if you have higher torque at higher RPM, that means you have more horsepower overall for your engine, right? At that specific RPM. So for a dyno queen, you can get the power, but at the expense, again, you're trading off something for something, right? You're going to have low torque at low RPM. If you're doing it for drag, you will sacrifice the low RPM because you're not there anyway. But if you are doing circuit, you're doing rally, you're doing autocross, you kind of need a broad power band. So you would probably sacrifice the high RPM power for a bit of the mid-range and low, right? So you'll have a more balanced power band, at least that's your target. So when things are scarce, when resources are scarce, you have to pick and choose what you're going to do. So that is why one important thing I always would like to say to you guys is always set your goals. Okay, it's not economics, this is more on business management side. You must set your goals, you must have your vision, mission statement of sorts, right? You must have an idea of what you want to achieve with your tuned car. And when you tune your car also, you also have to understand the concept of marginal benefit versus marginal cost. You can pour in so much resources. Let's just focus on engines for the time being. You can put so much resources on building your engine. You can build an engine, an existing engine, you can rebuild it for 50,000 pesos. You can slightly modify it for 100,000 pesos. You can super tune it for 250,000 pesos or more. If you don't have any parts for these engines, you can spend half $1 million in order for you to reach your targets. But let's say natural aspirated. Let's not go with turbos first. Okay, you can make a stupid Hyundai 2-liter engine uh, produce 265 horsepower. That has been done in the UK. Okay, the Hyundai Beta, the most well, it's not that suitable for high revs due to an inherent flaw in the cylinder head design. Flaw for it's not a flaw per se because the engines are reliable for normal driving duties, but when it comes to super tuning the engine, modifying the engine, there are certain things in the head that are not very good in the design aspect. Are you going to spend $1 million to replicate that the WRC setup? Maybe it's not $1 million. Go to UK, have the same engineers do it also for your own personal car. Will it cost you $1 million? Will it cost you $2 million? I don't know. For 265 horsepower. Well, on the other hand, if you put a turbo in the same engine, you'll be, instead of spending $2 million for the British guys to do it for you, you'll probably spend 200,000 pesos, 10% of the cost, and get the same power. Okay, what's the benefit for you to go that route except spend so much money? That's why when you say marginal benefit, by spending an incremental amount, how much incremental value do you get? You spend 2 million pesos to get 265 horsepower. You can definitely get a Genesis second-hand Genesis Coupe for about 600,000, the V6 model. That's 300 horsepower already. Rather than you modify your silly Hyundai engine to do 265 horsepower. So that's the concept of marginal benefit versus marginal cost. An incremental increase is not necessarily it's basically a law of diminishing returns sometimes when you're modifying engines. You spend so much to get so little. The only the worthwhile investment in doing that is if you are limited by rules and regulations, and if you have the budget to push the limits of those rules and regulations for you to get an advantage over your rivals. But if you're just a street guy, well, what's the marginal benefit for you to spend another 1.8 million pesos to get the same power as if you do it cheaper with a turbo? There are irrationalities. Tuning a Hyundai also seems irrational. Even the best of economists is that people do not necessarily think rationally. So that is one flaw of economics, or at least the interpretations of some regarding economics, that everyone thinks rationally. No, very few people think rationally actually. One thing I also learned in economics with my journey towards the mathematics of economics is, of course, calculus, more specifically limits. Okay, I'm not gonna explain what limits are. I kind of forgot everything about limits. But what one thing I understood about limits is when you solve a problem, you realize that whatever you do, that is the limit of what you can do. You can push harder and harder and harder to get an incremental increase, but there's a hard limit. There's for these engineering types, those in Formula One, there is a hard limit to certain things. The longevity of materials, the efficiencies of internal combustion, the efficiencies of electrical systems, and so on and so forth. I'm not an engineer. I don't know how it is to even go towards pushing things to the limit. That's their domain. But my domain is, again, going back to the 4AG example. I cannot rev more than 9,000 RPM. That's my mechanical limit. I can only go so much or the engine will blow. So those are the things sometimes that are not necessarily captured if you just do a basic cursory look on your power requirements or your desires. There are many limits to a car, right? Maybe your engine is weak, so you have to upgrade internals. Maybe your differentials, your axles might snap. So that might be the limit at a certain power. Of course, if you work towards upgrading those limitations, but first you have to recognize those limitations first. But once you recognize them, if you work towards raising those limits by modifying for strength, unlocking the higher revs, or so on and so forth, that's the path, right? That's why we modify our cars, is to improve the performance. And if we are limited, we remove the limits or increase the limits. That's what a tuner does, a proper tuner. If your goal is to, okay, you're stuck, natural aspirated, you're stuck with this engine. What are the limits to this engine? What are the mechanical limits to this engine? A typical limit is tuning. So usually tuning can be unlocked, the ECU can be reprogrammed, or you can replace the ECU with a programmable aftermarket piece. But after the electronic limit, you will hit the mechanical limit. So again, for the 4AGE, it's the oil pump. For Project Coupe all-wheel drive, it's the clutch. It could be other things for your car. So yeah, those are the things that my academic background in economics taught me about tuning cars. To reiterate, we always have to allocate our resources efficiently. With limited resources, our choices are also limited, but we have choices. So how do we maximize our the benefit that we are going to derive from that choice versus uh, the costs of picking that choice versus the other choices available to us, right? So that's why how I look at myself as a motorsport professional, as a consultant for aspiring motorsport enthusiasts who want to do it either as a hobby or towards a professional career in motorsport as a driver. Or let's look for the most efficient way possible for you to achieve your goals, yet at the same time doing it cost effectively. So efficiency is the key. That is how I feel that we could help you guys at KHL Motorsport. So if you guys are interested in specialized consultation in the motorsport field, especially in four-wheeled motorsport, please do hit us up. We are on Facebook, facebook.com/Alcohol Garage. So I guess that's pretty much it for this topic. It's yeah, if you like this type of content, do let us know. We'd like to hear your appreciation. If you have some constructive criticism, please make it constructive and not destructive. Hopefully, we see you guys on the next episode of the Contact Patch Podcast, where the rubber meets the road. Again, this is John Callum from KHL Motorsport signing off for this episode. See you guys next time. Ciao.